Hello everyone and welcome back to the Educate Call Snap channel. How you doing? So today we're going to be almost doing a preview of my meta tier list. I've been working on it this past week. I'm almost done with it. Just have to kind of do the final data points, but I can present today the tier list, the actual tier list, essentially the tiers between all the archetypes. We actually cover around 48 different archetypes in this one, where last time we had 27. So we're definitely doing a lot more work for me, but I do have the guides using a lot of data and just some common sense to kind of have a holistic view of it. So I do want to mention that there is going to be some, like, even though we're breaking it down, it doesn't mean they're all bad. Uh, the differences between the tiers is percentages, right? Maybe tier one is like 55 win rate. Tier four might be like 51 win rate, right? So they're all pretty strong decks, maybe except for like the last tier. So keep that in mind when we talk about all the cards and what they mean. So let's begin. So this is my second time recording it. The first time I tried putting them one by one, and I realized I had like 50 archetypes, and this would take forever. And I didn't want this to be a super long video, right? I know the meta tier list will actually be very long, so I wanted this to be like something people could, enjoy. So here we do have the first list, the tier zero. The only deck in there will be the Jeff deck. So Jeff Stature is the new kind of hotness that people have been running, and its stats kind of back itself up with being slightly above everything else. I think this deck and the Galactus, discussion are really the two annoying decks this patch, but there's a lot of flexibility in what you can play, and this is maybe the one that stands a little bit above, but they're all pretty good decks. So tier one has a pretty large amount of decks here. I would say the most notable thing in this tier is the plethora of Sarah decks. So I think Sarah really has come on its own this season. I think things like Sandman and stuff is not that prevalent. So Sarah has really jumped into the meta and really been a dominating force. So you have Sarah Darkhawk in here, Sarah Hidden Monkey, Sarah Surfer, Sarah regular Sarah Control. So there's a lot of really good decks here. We do also have Galactus in this tier. Galactus has been, I would say it used to be second fiddle to Thanos a lot of the times, but you can really see Thanos isn't in this tier anymore. I think Galactus stands a little bit above Thanos right now in terms of its percentages and the stats, but Thanos is still decent. I would say just a little bit below, but we do have some pretty nice deck lists in here. Doomwave and Deathwave are both here, where any Darkhawk deck is pretty powerful right now. Bass Bounce can also play Darkhawk. And then Nebula has come on its own. I think it's really just a Sunspot replacement. But if you do want to play like a Nebula focus deck, Nebula control, where you're really using all of Nebula, like using Nebula to its fullest potential, with Storms and Professor X is definitely another way of going at it. And its stats are pretty good for such a new deck. So that's definitely something you can play. And then discard with Mordork has just been a good archetype to play. It's just reliably strong. I do have, we're going to talk about it later, but I do have discard without Mordork, and the stats really don't stand up to Mordork discard in terms of how reliable it can be. So this is the tier A that we're going to have in the meta tier list, and just kind of showcasing that here. So in tier 2, right here we have Iron Lads. This is the new card in the block. A lot of people have been saying Iron Lad's the best card in the game right now, but just looking at the stats, obviously it's a new card, so its stats aren't reliable. So take this one in the grain of salt. I just put Iron Lad in here because people are gonna ask, oh, what is Iron Lad? Does it matter? Yeah, it matters, but its stats aren't anything special, I would say. And there's definitely some decks that like you can put Iron Lad into everything, but that doesn't mean that deck is automatically going to be better. There's definitely some consistency issues with Iron Lad, it seems, at least statistically. Though I do think there are some problematic pieces for Iron Lad. Things like Brood synergy and stuff is not balanced at all. And I do think in its current iteration, it's probably going to be like a problematic card because it's too swingy. And cards that are just too swingy that aren't bad are just frustrating to deal with, right? Like Galactus is a swingy card when it goes off, right? Like, and people are annoyed with that. Ireland has that same feeling where when it works so well, and it's just like, oh, you can't do anything because I got a free Sarah or a free Doctor Doom or a Mister whatever you want, right? Super early with 6 power on top of it, right? It's just such a swingy card that I think that it's probably not going to last in its current iteration. Now, just because a card when it works is broken doesn't mean that it always works or it's something you want to put into everything. So I do think there are some, not weaknesses, but it's not necessarily showing that it's omega broken statistically. So while I do think it probably needs some adjustment in some way, the stats don't really say, oh, this is like the greatest thing to come and you should definitely spend all your tokens on it. So I just definitely wanted to mention it, put it in the tier list just to kind of make that point. But it's still going to be strong and it's going to get better because Howard the Duck is coming and stuff like that. But this isn't an Iron Lad video. That was the last one. But just looking at some of the other cards and the other archetypes in here, we do have Patriot and Bastion both in here. Hella Casinos in this. And I believe we have Nimrod, Galactus, Psylocke. So we have a lot of these like very strong archetypes. Thanos is also in here now. Now you can see Thanos junk. I think that's like one of the better Thanos variants right now. And we have things like Wong Reveal, which really wasn't doing too hot, but I think there's definitely a lot of decks people are running that aren't running Cosmo anymore. And Wong Reveal can actually just stand on its own, do some work now. So it's definitely something that's risen up in the meta, even though you might not be seeing or playing it that often. And then some of the other common decks, She-Hulk. Cerebro 2 is what I want to talk about. That's the one I want to talk about. Cerebro 2, I maybe underrated it in the last meta tier list for April. I don't think I did my like due diligence and like really diving deep into how good it is because definitely had a lot of comments talking afterwards like, hey, Cerebro 2 and 3 are not the same. Cerebro 3 or 2 is actually I think better. And I kind of just bunched them together, didn't really fully do the research on how much of a difference Cerebro 2 versus Cerebro 3 is. And I actually think after doing it right, I have like a whole Excel sheet of all the stats of all the archetypes. And yeah, Cerebro 2 actually did much better, right? Like definitely stood on its own. I think is a viable climbing deck to play. So definitely something to learn from this. And then we have Move in here. Move in particular. I think the Heimdall Move deck, the traditional one where you just play like Stark Standard Move isn't that good. But the Mold version or just like an alternative Move. I thought Mold was like the best name for it, where you have other pieces besides Heimdall on 6 and other things to do is actually a viable Move composition. And Move is getting a lot of resources soon, so I do expect its archetypes to really just jump up and be a more viable thing. But even right now, you can play Move and Climb, so definitely something to think about. So next up, we have the tier 3s. There's not too much in tier 3. I would say the tier 1 and 2 have the most. But tier 3, you do have some more Thanos decks. I think Thanos really isn't the greatest in terms of stat-wise, how it's performing. There are some good versions of Thanos, but I do think there's a lot of Zoo. I mean, not Zoo, but a lot of Killmonger, a lot of like things that just mess with Thanos, and people have like big stats and stuff like that, and it's not the easiest to just have Thanos do all the things, right? Lockjaw really helped Thanos a lot, so it does suck. And then we do have regular Moon Girl Dino, so it's a little bit different than Dark Hawk Dino, right? You don't have the Dark Hawk, and it's definitely worse than having a Dark Hawk in your composition. So that one is in its own tier. Toxic Sarah, I would say maybe is one of the more overrated archetypes in terms of popularity to performance. It's a super popular deck because it's fun to play, but is it the most climbing efficient archetype? Probably not, especially with Sarah. All the Sarah decks are like super high up there, but Toxic Sarah is like noticeably below. And then we do have like Destroyer without or Destroy Null, which is a destroy deck without you know, using the full Galactus engine. You're just using destroy pieces, death and whatnot. And usually you're playing Null if you're not playing the other pieces, and it's something that could work, but not super meta. And then Destroyer Spectrum, obviously, those it's an okay archetype, but not amazing in terms of the matchups, especially with Enchantress. Enchantress really messing with a lot of the other really ongoing reliant decks. So that one does suffer. And then the Junk Viper, I think the Thanos version is the better one to use, but the regular Junk Viper is okay, but not super special and definitely hard to play. So not I wouldn't say super rewarding in terms of piloting. And then here we have Tier 4. So these decks are definitely, not crazy anymore. So you do have Thanos Lockjaw, right? The losing the ability to play multiple stones in a turn does hurt you a lot because it means you have to spend at least one mana on every turn on that Thanos location, and you can't flood it or set it up. It's not as clean for sure. And then you have Kazoo, regular Kazoo. Obviously, these aren't super great. You have the no dork discard. I made that name up. But yeah, I think if you don't have Modork, the discard definitely loses a lot of power. So I needed to have a difference, right? Because if I just put discard and you're like, oh, I don't have Modork, well, you're going to notice that it's not the same power level. So I wanted to make a distinction there. Then we have a Tuma control. It's high enough presence that I needed to put it in here, but I wouldn't say it's like the best archetype, right? You're usually running a Tuma and a lot of times Destroyer as well. Classic Lockjaw. Lockjaw has never been the same after the nerf, so I wouldn't necessarily be super impressive. Obviously, you can find variations of these decks to do well. Like no one's saying these decks are bad, right? Like you're maybe losing 4 or 5% win in the win percentages, right? You lose, so it is noticeable, but not crazy that you can't play these decks. So if you like playing Kazoo or whatever, you can play it. Right? Just know that it's maybe a little down the tier, but it's not going to stop you from climbing or anything like that unless your opponents are like meta slaves. So what could you do? And then the last tier is the tier 5s. These ones I still don't recommend. So I have been saying that, oh, you can play everything. Maybe these last tiers I just don't recommend. Cerebro 3 is just not statistically doing well. I would say it doesn't really feel like you're going to have a good time climbing. There's a lot of like RNG, and your cards are more expensive than Cerebro 2, so it's a lot harder to just flood at the final turns and things like that. And then we have traditional control. So the problem with traditional control is you don't have things like Nebula or any of those any of those like expensive tools to really take advantage of the control archetype. I think control archetype is good right now, but if you don't have any of the pieces except maybe a Daredevil, it just doesn't feel that great. And people have Jeff now, so if you don't have Jeff in control and other people have Jeff, like you've lost your edge in terms of how much advantage you can do. So it's just not the same in the meta game with the Jeff editions and other tools that people have access to. So wouldn't really rely on that archetype to carry you. And then Heimdall move, classic Heimdall is just not good in my opinion. If you don't have anything fancy, like a Magneto or Leech or something, Shang-Chi, whatever tech you want to play. It's just too predictable, and people know what you're gonna do, and its ceiling isn't that high. So I don't really like the Heimdall move without any tech. Molt move, right, and having tech and stuff like that is much better, but nothing, no strategies besides Heimdall and six is just not going to cut it. Mr. Negative can be good, and especially with Iron Lad, I think could have something to do. But Mr. Negative has always had the problem of consistency. It's just not a consistent deck, and if you're trying to climb, it's just not going to be the key for that. Same thing with Agatha. It's playing random cards for you, right? Like it's not going to be a consistent way of climbing at the highest levels. People will have answers to your cards. You have to play around what they're doing. If like Agatha's playing randomly, you're usually not going to be in a positive situation. So those are really the ones I would straight avoid. But overall, there's a lot of decks to play. I would say this is definitely one of the more healthier metas that I've seen in the game in a long time, in terms of you can play almost like 40 different decks realistically and do okay with them. Now obviously there's going to be ones that are better than others, but it is healthy to have such a big repertoire of things to do. Now, yeah, stature and maybe Galactus are problematic in some ways, but it's still good that you can do so much with this. So we're gonna have the link up, and I want to have the full guide up hopefully tomorrow. So look out for that. I don't know how long that's going to be, because even this like speeding through one is almost 20 minutes. So can you imagine? Like I'm thinking it's going to be over an hour. But overall, take care of yourselves. Hope you found a deck, and hope that I get the full list done tomorrow. Because damn, I've been working on this for way too long. I'll see you in the next one. Take care, everybody. Once you watch him, you won't go back. He'll teach you to marvel snap. Your skills will be